Go ahead and get started. Got a recording going. That's excellent. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening. Um, really excited about the conversation we're going to be having, and so grateful that everyone would give some of their evening to be here. I'll just quickly introduce our panelists. We're lucky to be joined by Representative Ray Ward. He represents the 19th District here in Utah, and he's been in that role for 9 years now. Ben Abbott is the executive director of Grow the Flow, and in his spare time is also a BYU professor. And Katie Newburn is the education and outreach director at Friends of Great Salt Lake. And she's very passionate about outdoor and environmental education. And so we're lucky to have her here as well. And Jake Dreyfous he leads the government relations initiative here at Grow the Flow and has been watching this most recent legislative session like a hawk. So lucky to have him here as well. Ben has a little activity for us as we get started, a poll everywhere question for the audience, and then we'll jump right in with some questions for our panelists.
Thanks, Addison. Yeah, we wanted to make sure that this was interactive, and honestly, there are lots of ways of looking at this, and so we have a Q&A interface that we'll share with all of you. We thought we'd get a little bit of feedback on your thoughts of how the legislative session went regarding Great Salt Lake. So let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Okay. So if you go to pollev.com and add Ben554 as the code, that will let you answer these questions. You don't need to log in or sign up for anything. I'll put the link here in the chat. Good. Looks like somebody figured it out quick. And this question is just, what grade would you give the advocacy community regarding Great Salt Lake in the 2024 session? So this first one, I thought that, we're kind of used to blaming others or finding fault in others. And I want you to think about how effective were we as advocates. And so this could also include Representative Ward, Representative Bennion, who will be joining us later. But just as the advocacy community, how did we do? Give it a few more seconds. We've got most of the responses in, it looks like. Okay. So pretty good. A B or C, so definitely a passing grade. Fewer people rated us with an A, nothing to improve on. So let's go to the next question. I started on the wrong question. Sorry, you guys. Let me see. Okay, here we are. So now, if we think about the Utah legislature, how do we think their response was? What grade would we give them regarding Great Salt Lake? So set aside any of the other issues that you're really happy about or sad about, but regarding Great Salt Lake, how did that go? Okay. So nobody gave an A. Representative Ward, I won't ask you if you answered the poll. We'll leave that aside for now. A lower grade, but
Well, they didn't pass my bill, so I'm not going to give them an A.
That's right. I like this too because it shows among the people here tonight, there's a range of views, ranging from, hey, they're doing a pretty good job trying to get things done, to those who are feeling pretty dissatisfied. And I'm encouraged that we can be represented that way. And those are the two main questions. I'll leave it from from now on in this Q&A interface. And that should pull up the opportunity to submit questions and then also rank questions as we have a discussion. And then at the end, when Addison's ready to take questions from the group, we will look at those. So feel free to submit questions at any point. I'll stop the share so that you can see each other.
Thanks for doing that, Ben. And I think that gives us a really useful framework for our discussion here tonight. I mean, when we're looking at both the advocacy groups and the legislature, there's certainly room to improve. So let me just start with this question for all of our panelists. And we'll start with you, Representative Ward. What do you think were the most important bills in appropriations that passed? And what maybe surprised you about this legislative session?
Well, I mean, leadership in both houses each ran a bill related to the lake, right? There was a large bill that came from House leadership with Casey Snyder as a sponsor, and a large bill that came from the Senate with President Adams as the sponsor. And when you're the Senate president, then you get to even have a fancy bill title. I think he called his generational water assessments. And I think both of those were important, right? Important bills. So the one that came from the House pointed out the fact that the evaporative mineral industries on the lake have been outside of our normal water rights structure ever since things got put in place. And so every other water right before water got to the lake was senior or junior to something, but it all kind of in a pecking order. And then that makes it so you can tell who doesn't get water when the water runs out. But since water that went into the lake was regarded as water wasted, then the water rights granted to the mineral evaporative companies just said, hey, if there's water in there, you can have as much as you want, because it's obviously been wasted. So whatever you'd like to use, you can use. And especially when the things that we've done in the last couple of years centered around saving water upstream for the express purpose that it could, at least some of it, go into the lake, then some other way of calculating that had to be come up with. And so there was a fight between House leadership and those companies behind the scenes. They were pretty heated at times. But in the end, they also got brought into that structure. And in the end, it will require a plan, a water plan that the state engineer will keep track of, so that she keeps track of where the water came from when it went into the lake, so that water rights that were senior water rights that were allowed to go into the lake don't just get all consumed by the evaporative mineral industry. So I don't know how that will work out over the long term. I am not an expert, and it requires obviously some serious mathematical modeling, because all water that goes into the lake does eventually evaporate off. But I do think that was an important piece of legislation to pass. The one that came from President Adams in the Senate, I think, had two parts to it. One part, he said, look, we got, a couple of large water districts in this state, and they do a good job. There's a Weber Basin, and there's Central Utah Water District, and Jordan Water District, and those guys do a good job for the state. They have done a good job for the state, but there hasn't really been, and they do talk with each other, right? They're a small group, so they do talk with each other all the time, but there hasn't been any official structure that had them communicating with each other and coordinating with each other. As time goes on, as the population in Utah grows, and we try and be more accurate about our water rights so that we don't just use up more than actually exists, it becomes more important that they are visiting with each other, and it also probably becomes more important that we have water infrastructure that can move water back and forth between those water districts, which we have not really paid attention to before. And so his bill did that. And then it also set up a water agent to try and think about whether or not in the long term, water might be available to the state from some source outside of the state. And I think President Adams readily admitted that no one knows exactly what that would look like, or over how long of a timeline that might happen. There are certainly other places in the Western United States, certainly if you look up as far as Canada, where there is more water available than there is here. And there is certainly at least a theoretical possibility that some desalination plants could be built on the coast in exchange for California giving up some of its water right in the Colorado River back to Utah, right? So that Utah could pay for a plant down there in exchange for Colorado River rights up here that currently go to California. That's at least theoretically possible. So I don't know where that leads, and no one does right now, but it's not unreasonable to at least think about it. So I think those are the two most important bills that passed. I'm sure there were some other smaller ones, but after a while, your head boggles trying to keep track of all of them.
What about you, Katie? Was there anything that surprised you in a good way or a bad way during the session?
Yeah, so one thing that was surprising to me is how uh non-descriptively named many of these bills were: water-related changes, water modifications, water amendments. Kind of difficult to make sense of the impact that those various bills will have. And at the same time, I was pleasantly surprised by how many representatives decided to run and introduce bills related to water. It seemed like a lot of leaders are really recognizing the urgency to reach greater sustainability for our water resources, and kind of throwing their hat in the ring to propose solutions to that effect. And I'm also, surprised and to some extent disappointed that some bills that felt kind of, like they shouldn't be controversial, didn't end up passing. So I think we'll talk about that a little later on too. But I would agree with Representative Ward that HB 453, which strengthened regulations for the mineral extraction industry, is probably the most consequential from this session. And just to mention a couple others that Friends of Great Salt Lake was tracking, that are not quite as glamorous, but still important. One of our big priorities is improving water measurement and telemetry. So SB 18, water modifications. Oh, excuse me, no, SB 118, which is, no, SB 77, sorry. It expanded a funding source for expanded telemetry stream gauges to help us better monitor our water resources. That's really important so that managers can make more informed decisions. And then the other one was HB 61, which gives the state engineer a little bit more authority to implement water measurement and telemetry across the watershed.
Ben or Jake, did you have anything to add? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Oh, I think you're muted.
When you want me to, I'm happy to talk about how bills get named and why water bills die. So
we want to hear both of those.
Shall I talk to that for a second here?
Please do. Please do.
So bills get named almost always just by the drafting attorneys. So the legislators have very, very little say in how a bill gets named, unless you're President Adams, then you get some say. But you explain to the drafting attorneys what you want the bill to do, and a bill name comes back to you. You can go back and push back on it a little bit if you want. And certainly sometimes amendments get made in a bill that do wind up changing the topic of the bill significantly. And so sometimes the bills will get renamed when that happens. I had a bill that happened to this session. But those are not, I think it's different from national bills, right? So when President Biden and Mitt Romney get together and pass a bill, it's the Inflation Reduction Act or the Save Our Children Act or whatever. But the bills here are largely just named by drafters, and that's just that on most of them, which is why they are pretty nondescript for the most part. A bit about why water bills die more than other bills. Most bills on most topics, there's a lot of hurdles, even for a regular bill, right? You got to get out of rules, you got to get out of committee, you got to get across the floor, you got to go do that again in the other house, even when you're not there, and people can lobby against it behind your back. But water bills, lucky water bills, get two extra fairly difficult hurdles that they have to get over, or they often will just get killed. And that is that the legislators, and led by probably the rural legislators, have just decided that there's two extra committees that you have to pass completely outside of the normal legislative process, or they will just kill your bill. And so there's a legislative water task force that has some legislators on it, and they basically demand, and that meets during the interim, they basically demand that you come and beg before them, like you would be for a regular committee and get their approval. That's not written down anywhere in the legislative rules. It's just that they have decided, and they will. And this is what killed my water reporting bill. If that bill hasn't gone before that committee, then they'll just stand up and say, look, I don't even care what's in the bill. You didn't come before the Legislative Water Task Force, so we are certainly not voting for your bill here. So there's that committee. And then on top of that, there is another one, which is the Water Task Advisory Council, I think. And that one doesn't have legislators on it, but it does have a good mix of other different people from the state who know about water issues. And it is stacked with rural folks on it. So there's a lot more rural voice on there than urban voice on it. And really, it's the same dynamic. Unless that completely non-legislative committee gives it a stamp of approval, then they'll just vote it down. So my bill is an example of that. So my bill was not drafted early enough to get to all those places. I had a draft of it to go in December before the task force. The task force made some recommendations, which I implemented, but then their meeting schedule was such that they decided to cancel their last meeting. So although I was able to say that I had made the changes that they requested, I was not able to say that they had given an actual stamp of approval to the actual draft that I was bringing. And because I didn't have a draft, I didn't go before the Water Task Force. And so in the Senate committee, then they stood up and said exactly that. We have not seen this bill before, and we are certainly not going to vote for this bill here on the noble Senate floor. And that just killed it right there, even though everything else had passed unanimously up to that point. And that does give, I mean, the ones that do that are, so that was Scott Sandel, Senator Sandel, and Senator Hinkins. So by those mechanisms, I would say that the rural folks regard themselves as the main people to get to have a say in water, and they certainly get to have a veto over any bill that goes through. Not an official, but an unofficial one that's quite effective.
Interesting. Ben and Jake, do you want to give your overall thoughts of the session before we move on?
Yeah, I think there's kind of maybe two main perspectives that I can add, and I won't go back into the weeds of these bills, but for me, I saw kind of two general patterns or big patterns in the session. The first being, like Katie was mentioning, a bigger emphasis on expanding monitoring and telemetry. We saw RFAs funded from Representative Casey Snyder for several $1 million for more monitoring devices. Several bills, like Katie was saying, SB 18, 77. And then we saw sort of this duality of conservation and augmentation, I think, particularly emphasized by SB 211. And, I think Ben and I have had this discussion in that, in this really long-term view of things, these bigger planning bills are important, but we also feel like there wasn't equal emphasis given to conservation today and now at the scale that it necessitates. And with that SB 211 bill, there were some concerns from the public, from our organization and others around this sort of limiting of public opinion in this bill, and just sort of removing some of these steps, like the ability to submit grant requests and stuff like that, with the workings of the Watershed Development Council and the water agent, that we think should be addressed, because obviously these are things that are affecting Utah constituents down the line, and our perspective and opinion on these decisions matters as much as anyone else's.
Yeah, I agree. And the positive surprise for me was just how assertive the legislature was with the mining industry, right? The mineral extraction industry. I was surprised about that. And I know that we can't solve this problem by looking at that sector, right? The slice of the pie is relatively small, but it provides a model of how when there is conflict, it doesn't mean that we just give up and don't address the issue, right? And maybe this is a model next session and in the interim for how we can approach some of these other discussions, where it isn't all voluntary and only if people want, but that there is a dimension of this is a problem that our state is facing that we need to address, and so we need to have realistic conversations there. But as Jake said, the discouraging surprise was I felt like there was quite a bit of pushback against the idea of conservation, right? And I even heard the phrase used a few times, like, we don't want to put all of our eggs in the conservation basket. And I'm a hydrologist, and from a global water security perspective, it's just abundantly clear that conservation is the most cost-effective, fastest tool that we have with the fewest negative side effects. And you should try to maximize conservation before you think about augmentation and all of these other things. And so I hope that attitude does change.
So one thing that Grow the Flow focused on, as well as other organizations, was trying to get citizens to go up to the Capitol and lobby legislators. And so I'm just curious, Representative Ward, how effective or maybe anti-productive do you think that some of these citizen lobbying efforts were?
Well, I don't know. Um, uh, I don't always sit in the places where the lobbying is happening, right? So, there's lobbying in particular committee rooms on particular bills. I was glad, just in general, I got lobbied a little bit, so I was glad to see people up there. I guess I believe a couple things. I believe that lobbying does work. I believe it works when it is best, when it is polite and persistent, and keeps going over time, enough that people start to create some authentic relationships with their legislators. So the legislator knows, oh, this person was here before and they're back again. They're still polite, but they're still back again. It works best eventually if people come to believe that they either get elected or unelected based on their decisions. From it, it was good to have some lobbying up there. I guess I also believe that it is very difficult to know exactly which bit of lobbying changed someone's mind. And I think you kind of have to give up on saying, oh, I really need to know that this sacrifice that I made or this conversation that I made is the thing that finally changed someone. People's minds change slowly and imperceptibly, and I think they don't even usually remember when their mind changed about something. So I do think you kind of have to just keep at it. I think this issue has more hope to it in the long term, because I don't think there is a super well organized and entrenched interest on the other side, right? So the poor folks who want to come up and lobby for gun reform in ways that would reduce guns have on the other side well entrenched, well recognized advocates backed by national lobbying groups that do attack and remove Republican legislators from office if they vote anything against the NRA, and that is much more difficult. And this issue is a new issue to Utah's way of thinking about things, and it doesn't have that. So pushing on it and just keeping at it over time, I think, will move the needle.
So that actually leads us to, I think, an important question about just the overall sense of urgency that we had during this legislative session. And any of you guys can speak to this, but was the sense of urgency that we need there, or was this just kind of really low in terms of the urgency? Important step moving forward, and something we can build on, or some people in the advocacy community specifically have been particularly underwhelmed. I'm just interested to hear your guys' thoughts.
I can just say that today I went to the Utah Water Task Force, and they reviewed all of the legislative water bills dealing with water in general, and there were 37 bills and 20 of them passed. So I would say that definitely there is a sense of urgency about water in general. And I do think we have members of the legislature who don't believe science and don't understand the impacts that climate change will have and is having. So I think that is a very real concern. And I don't know, maybe Representative Ward has a better feel on how we address that, but I think that's a concern that I have.
And by the way, thank you for joining us, Representative Bennion. Happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Did I hear you ask me how I was going to persuade all the other Republicans to believe that climate change is a real thing?
Just a softball question.
Just a nice softball question. I don't know the answer to that, Galen. I'm trying the best I know how.
You know, one if I could respond, one of the interesting things that I see is there's interest on this issue, whether you call it the Great Salt Lake restoration or water security. There's interest that's really nonpartisan here, and that
that
is
is super helpful.
Yep,
Yeah.
totally. And that's one of the things that I have felt encouraged about. There were a lot of bills, many of them passed. It's also clear, I'm very unsure that the bills that we have now are going to get us very far down that path, right? Because we are pioneering a new path here. No one has figured out how to save these lakes anywhere in the world. And so I think we need to have that humility and realize that we're going to try some things are going to work, some aren't. And I don't quite know where I fall on this question of, do we need to wait and see how effective the current measures are, right? Or do we need to continue tossing some of them out and putting new pieces in? It's actually one of the reasons why I'm so disappointed that we didn't get your bill, Representative Ward, that would have tried to put a progress bar on those different things. But I'm at least very encouraged that nobody can get away with anymore, and this is kind of cynical way to say it, but nobody can get away with saying that this isn't an issue, right? That's just not going to pass muster.
I do think everybody agrees on that, right? And from a simple-minded way of looking at it, you just say, well, look, we think we're pretty close to whatever you think about how many water rights we've given. We think we're pretty close to not having any more to give out, and we do think 2 million more people are moving to this state. So that alone, without anything else about being worried about climate change, I think is enough to get people's attention to say, well, if we want those people to move to the state, or not even move here, but to say those are our children who grow up and still want to live here, then we need to do something to have a better plan for that. I wanted to speak a minute about, Ben, you talked about just the discounting of conservation. And I think I could tell you in my mind, I think I know 2 reasons for that. And I don't know how to fix them really. But I think the 2 reasons for that are that I believe there are those in the legislature who don't want to say it out loud, but they do still want to divert the bear. And so they are anxious to portray using the water as being helpful and diverting the water as being exactly what's needed, and emulating our pioneer forebears by diverting that water and putting it to useful use. And I also think the issues that the state is negotiating between other states in the Colorado River also play into this. So there are certainly legislators and in leadership who perceive that the best way to get our best deal as we try and negotiate with the other Colorado River Basin states is to be using the water now. And historically, that has been what got states more water, right? Historically, if you were using the water some way, then it made it harder for somebody else to negotiate against you when you were saying how much water was needed. And so Utah persists today, and I wouldn't really expect otherwise in saying that, well, we have water on the Colorado that's unused, and California is using our share, and so we're only trying to get our fair share from the Colorado River. But they are certainly not until that issue is settled, which at some point it will get settled. I don't know when, but the work on it is honestly going on. I think you're going to see legislative leadership be reluctant to say, oh yeah, we don't need that, our solution is just to conserve. But you still have to just keep pushing on it, and the other issue is going to come to a resolution at some point. I don't know how or where, but it will. There'll be an agreement hammered out. At least that's my belief.
I really appreciate you, Representative Ward, just like recognizing, that there are still like a large, conglomerate of our legislature that is trying to pursue some of these, what we view as, I guess, outdated, sort of water development projects. And I think that speaks to the need for us as constituents, to really make an effort in building these relationships with our representatives. I think we're effective lobbying during the session, but you guys also have so much on your plate, during that time. And there's only, we can't expect you to keep 1,000 bills straight, right? So if we as constituents can make those efforts to build those relationships in the off season and, to a point where we feel comfortable expressing our needs and opinions and, feeling as though we're heard, I feel like that's an important piece of the puzzle that's still missing in a lot of ways.
Agreed.
We've got some questions coming in from the audience, and so I'd like to read some of those off. And let me just put these forward to both Representative Bennion and Ward. This one says, can you talk about SB 211, especially in regards to fears that it involves the Bear River development?
So I serve on Natural Resources, Agriculture, Environment Committee, and my sense is that it is not about that. It's more about efforts to bring water from Idaho or other states. And that's hard to imagine how that would happen, given that we're all in this dry West. But that is their effort, that they see at least Nevada and maybe, I can't remember if it's Colorado, working with California to pay California to desalinate water so that they will use less water and that Nevada can keep more of theirs. So it's issues like that they're interested in being at the table for. And that's my perception. And again, anything that bill allows to happen will have to come back to the legislature for approval. And again, we're not in a good position with enough people understanding the science and supporting the long-term ecology of our state to fend off a bad bill, in my opinion.
Do you have anything to add to that, Representative Ward?
Sometimes it's hard to tell at the end of a bill or at the end of a legislative session if you won a big victory or if you just got creamed and lost. And I mean that in all seriousness. And this is a bill that I think we might have won a significant victory on, but time will tell. I don't know. My perception in the 2 or 3 weeks before the session was that at that time, this bill was going to be much more directed towards diverting the bear in a more overt way. Some of the things that I heard said sounded to me like rhetoric about why it was necessary to divert the bear now and to move forward on those projects. So in the end, when this bill didn't do that, I felt happy about that. But I still don't know if tucked in this bill are some precursor things that will happen that ultimately will lead to that outcome. So that was my thoughts about the bill. But for me, it's going to take another 2 or 3 years to understand better what happens next from it.
And if I could jump in, I saw the question about, what do we do between the sessions? And I think that Representative Bennion and Ward's comments really emphasize that. Like, yes, the bill is passed, but the outcome of that bill is not set. And a lot of it depends on how involved we stay. So the very constructive and organized lobbying that went on before the session, to bring to the fore the risk of the Bear River development moving forward, I think was helpful. And likewise, we all need to watch, what is this new water entity going to do? Because there are constructive things they could do or counterproductive things. And so I hope that all of us can leave this conversation realizing this is, even though the session's only 45 days, it's a full-time job to follow and develop the relationships. And it also can be super rewarding. There are so many wonderful people on Capitol Hill and, of course, in our communities. And so please do join the different groups that are following and supporting the rescue of Great Salt Lake. I know that most of you probably do, but I'm really, really grateful.
Let me just point out one other document, because there's other documents, there's other stuff that happens outside the legislative session. For example, Weber Basin has got like a 50-year plan out there, right? They're planning way, way ahead. And in that document right now, it still says they're going to divert the bear because that's the only way to get enough water for what is going to be needed. 2 or 3 years ago, when Brad Wilson first started really bringing attention to the Great Salt Lake, which I was very grateful for, I thought, okay, look, he's brought this attention, and Weber Basin was coming up on redoing that plan. Surely with this, that we'll be able to get that taken out of the plan. Because surely we don't want that if we say we're going to save the Great Salt Lake, to have that officially in the plan. But when I went back and pushed on it, it was, stonewalling is one word, but it's a very polite bureaucratic answer. But in the end, you just feel like you punched into the tar baby, and the person isn't quite giving you an answer, and you're not quite sure why they're not giving you an answer. And after a while, you realize it, and this takes you a year. The reason they're not giving me an answer is because there's someone somewhere else who is telling them they still want that in, and that someone, my belief is in the leadership of the Senate, that still kind of wants that in. So it's in there for now. Nothing's happened with it for now, but that's another thing that sooner or later it either will get diverted, or the leadership of the Weber Basin district will come to the conclusion that we are not doing that, and that's coming out of the plan. So, quiet pressure, or when they have their discussions or at their councils, to ask why that's still in there. I mean, there's other places that these things get considered besides just the legislature.
One of the questions we see coming in from a lot of constituents is, what can we do moving forward? And Katie, I know you're in public education with this kind of stuff. We have a lot of people in the state who are extremely alarmed by this issue. We have others who don't really know what's going on. What is the message that you try to send to both of those groups? And then let's just open it up more broadly to anyone who'd like to answer the question of, what can people do moving forward past this legislative session?
Yeah, thanks. So through our field trip program, we bring thousands of students out to Great Salt Lake every year. It's really wonderful. And we serve students and parents from all across northern Utah who have very diverse backgrounds and values and familiarity with Great Salt Lake and the threats facing it. So what we've already heard a little bit, and what we have working in our favor on this issue is that whatever your values are, you have an interest in preserving Great Salt Lake. It's really an issue that transcends a lot of traditional political polarity. So I think, as an educator, I just try to meet people where they're at. You have to show empathy for their perspective, and then invite them to contribute in a way that's appropriate for them. So for frustrated Salt Lake City residents, I try to explain the nuance of alfalfa farming, for example. I think there's a lot that, an urban resident doesn't necessarily understand or appreciate about that. And it's easy to place blame. And for those who are not familiar with this issue, generally showing satellite images of the lake's decline since the 1980s, that tends to speak for itself. Pretty powerful, visual there. And ultimately, we need to empower folks to contribute to the solution in whatever way they can within their, position in the watershed, instead of placing blame on other water users. We're all a part of the pie and have the power to contribute.
Thanks, Katie.
And I might just add and emphasize, I think the point that I made a few minutes ago, which is your representatives and your senators are not these big, scary people that, they are just people. And, it's really important for us as their constituents to reach out and connect. And, first connect just on a human level and, meet them where they are and, continue those conversations, right? If we're not willing to sit down and have these conversations, or we're only willing to sort of take the fight on through our screens or whatever else, this can lead to turmoil or tension, or I think generally I see this sort of division or crux between environmental groups and the Utah legislature, and those divisions are augmented when we approach these conversations combatively and reactively, and those walls are taken down when we're able to just have those conversations as if we were talking to a family member or a friend or community members that are alongside us, because that's who our representatives and senators really are.
Anyone else on that one?
to the question of opportunities for folks to get involved outside of the legislative session, I think we've already heard of the two kind of governmental entities, the Legislative Water Development Commission and the Utah Water Task Force, who kind of more explicitly review proposed legislation. And those entities meet outside of the legislative session. And we were, participating in that just as members of the public, essentially, for kind of a preview of what was to come for this session. So I'd encourage anybody to attend those meetings if you're able. And then another important advisory body is the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, which is a group of stakeholders from many different interests: mineral extraction, brine shrimp industry, conservation, waterfowl, the list goes on, who are now kind of collected underneath Commissioner Brian Steed, but they kind of all share their various interests with regard to management on the lake. And I think that's a really valuable group to be, informed by, and also kind of holding to account at time and sharing your own perspective as a resident. And their next meeting is coming up on Wednesday, March 13th, so the week from today. And there's opportunity for public comment during that meeting as well.
Thanks for sharing all that important information, Katie. So Representative Ward had to jump off to get to his next appointment. And we were hoping to keep this meeting, I think, around 45 minutes. So I just want to open it up to the panelists to see if they had kind of any parting thoughts for us this evening.
I just want to thank you all for being involved and working on this issue. It's so important. And, even just joining this has got me thinking about what I can do better. I was able to attend the Great Salt Lake Symposium last March, and the things that were shared there were so alarming to me. I'm wondering if, as I request study items for natural resources, if we can have one of those BYU, University of Utah professors that showed us, that we're not forecast to have snow in our mountains like in 2050. I don't think that's the reality that my colleagues on that interim committee understand. I think that I could do a better job of trying to bring those presentations to that committee to help them understand the concerns that all of you have, that they don't fully see. And so I will work on that. And we have so many different topics on our mind all the time. And even though water is top of mind to me, just having the moment to sit down with all of you and think about, as I'm proposing topics for interim study, this is something I could work on to bring to them. So thank you. Every interaction that you have with us really does help all of us.
If I could jump off of Representative Bennion there, first just start by thanking you for recognizing, that at the end of the day, this issue is so large that's like the scariest part about it, but also for me, one of the most empowering, because it allows us to all come to this issue from where we are. And, if anyone and everyone can just take some time to think critically and say, what do I bring to the Great Salt Lake? I think that goes a long way. And you sitting on this panel discussion and listening in, that is bringing something to the lake, because you're getting involved and you're learning. If it's, being able to donate to an organization that is doing some of this work, that's getting involved. If it's volunteering, that's getting involved. If it's, helping make a connection, or just having a conversation with your family members who might not know about the issue like you do, that's getting involved too. So I think it's really empowering when you take a second and say, I can be a part of this too. And not everyone's going to do that in the same way, but everyone can do that in some way.
I'll jump in and leave Ben with final thoughts, which will be great. But I would just say that as we're reflecting on each legislative session, it's important to keep in mind that with regard to water policy, at least over the last 5 years or so. Each session is kind of building off of the last and kind of, remembering the progress that has been made, I think is encouraging when we realize that, we've seen more reform of like structural water policy starting in like 2022 through now than ever before in Utah history. And we're seeing some of those big programs kind of playing out, building momentum, the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office. And so it's tough sometimes to feel like the urgency is not matched by legislative action. But I think that there is a lot of foundation that's been laid and a lot of momentum in the right direction. And we just need to stay the course and stick around.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone. My thoughts were right in line with what you said, Katie. Like Steve Clyde, one of the top water attorneys in the state, has said, we've come light years over the past 5 years from where we were. But then he always follows up by saying, we still have light years to go. And in many ways, we still are in the preparing the rescue phase right now, rather than the actual rescue. And that can be frustrating, especially when facing, as you mentioned, Jake, just the stakes, right? This is a really high stakes race that we're in, and we've got to work together to get that done. The thought that the final thing that I'd invite all of us to do is last session I was super depressed at the end of the session, not in 2024, but in 2023. I was just kind of beside myself, not knowing how we were going to make any progress. And I was very skeptical of the creation of the Great Salt Lake Commissioner position. I thought this was just a symbolic thing that the legislature's doing to cover their butts to say we did something, right? It's turned out, in my estimation, that that's one of the most important changes that's been made. That there now is a centralized person working full-time to advocate for and make sure that we are good stewards of this absolutely irreplaceable and essential ecosystem at the heart of our community. And so what I am trying to do is, over the next few months, how can we support Brian Steed, right, the new commissioner? How can we make sure that he has the best chance possible to get the priorities and changes in place that he has identified with his team? And a lot of that's going to depend on us thanking our representatives and senators for creating that position and encouraging them to continue supporting it. And so I think that that is something that is pretty clear, right? You don't have to know even a bill number, but thank them for creating the Great Salt Lake Commissioner and thank them for the great work that he's doing, and ask them to make sure that he has the funding and political support that he needs to really move forward.
Thanks so much for our panelists. Yes, give them a round of applause, even if you're muted. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening. It's been a pleasure spending this evening with you all. Katie shared some really helpful links in the chat as well, so you can check out the Commissioner's Strategic Plan and the Friends of Great Salt Lake Legislative Summary, which are both great documents. But again, thank you. And I know we didn't get to everybody's questions here tonight, but as was mentioned, keep in contact with your legislators, and that's really important. So thanks, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Addison. Thanks, Grow the Flow team. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us, Katie.
Anytime.